Launch it now. I'll cover the penalty. Amelia Madison's smirk cut through the tension of the operations room. Outside, a fully boarded jet with 180 passengers sat poised to hurtle directly into a storm system that should have forced a runway closure hours ago. Mason Carter, a single father in a worn flight crew jacket, calmly refused to authorize the departure. Amelia dismissed him instantly and greenlit the flight herself. But before the engines could even spool to full power, Mason made a single telephone call. 3 minutes later, air traffic control locked down the runway. Federal agents swept through the doors, and Amelia stood paralyzed as their verdict echoed through the silent room. If you believe quiet resolve can outlast raw authority, stay with this narrative and watch Mason dismantle the entire crisis. The day had started quietly enough at the international hub outside Denver, long before anyone anticipated federal agents striding across the tarmac. A formidable storm system was coalescing along the route to London, and Madison Atlantic Airways Flight 217 was slated to carry 180 passengers directly into its path. Among them were corporate executives, elderly vacationers, and families with international connections they had orchestrated for months. Mason arrived at the command center earlier than anyone else, his habit before any mission that provoked his unease. 3 anomalies troubled him almost at once. The weather radar depicted a storm cell capable of generating violent turbulence precisely along the aircraft's planned corridor. A recently replaced pressure sensor had never undergone its mandatory validation flight, and the maintenance log contained a 4-hour gap that defied any logical explanation. Connor Blake, the airline's director of operations, insisted the gap was merely a data entry oversight. He assured everyone that the aircraft had been thoroughly examined and was entirely airworthy, his tone smooth and dismissive, as it always was when he wished to terminate a discussion prematurely. Mason refused to accept verbal assurances over documented evidence. He requested the original technical records and demanded that the flight be postponed until the system could be properly validated. It was a modest request, one he had made scores of times before, but something in Connor's expression told him this occasion would prove different. In a fleeting, tranquil moment before the day's turmoil consumed him, Mason received a voice message from his 8-year-old son, Luke. The boy wished his father a productive day and reminded him of their scheduled evening call. Mason smiled at the recording, then tucked the phone back into his pocket. From that instant onward, the day belonged entirely to the airline, and Luke would not reappear until the story's subdued final hours. The narrative gently reveals, without lingering, that Mason had once probed a crash that claimed over 100 lives. That catastrophe had originated from a single line of maintenance data disregarded because the airline prioritized schedule adherence over scrutiny. He recalled standing in a field outside a small Midwestern town at 4 a.m, illuminating a charred fuselage section with a flashlight, and realizing for the first time that every disaster he would ever investigate began as an ordinary choice made by an ordinary person who briefly believed the rules could bend without consequence. Since that day, Mason adhered to one immutable principle: no flight ever outweighed the people seated within it. That conviction explained why Samuel Hayes had trusted him for nearly 15 years. The two had collaborated during Mason's tenure as a federal investigator, long before he left government service to raise his son after his wife's unexpected death. Samuel had learned across numerous cases that Mason never inflated a threat nor issued a warning merely to protect his own standing. When Mason phoned to report a concern, Samuel understood that something tangible was already in motion, a comprehension that would prove pivotal before the day concluded. Up in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the runway, Amelia Madison was engaged in a call with the board of directors, her voice steady even as the financial indicators behind her painted a grimmer picture. Madison Atlantic Airways had just posted its 3rd consecutive quarterly loss. Flight 217 was intended as the triumphant inauguration of a new international route, packed with investors and aviation journalists specifically flown in to witness the event. If the flight were cancelled, the repercussions would cascade rapidly. The airline risked losing a partnership contract worth hundreds of millions, would owe compensation to every passenger on board, and reporters already circling the story would portray the carrier as unfit for international operations. The banks currently restructuring the company's enormous debt would lose confidence at the most inopportune moment. Connor leveraged this pressure against Amelia, arguing that Mason was overreacting and presenting a report claiming the storm would shift before the aircraft reached the danger zone. Mason calmly pointed out that the report was over 40 minutes old. The latest radar data showed the storm wasn't retreating eastward, it was expanding directly across the flight path. Amelia asked Mason to assign a probability, some figure indicating the likelihood of an actual incident. Mason responded that aviation safety was never determined by the probability of disaster. When an aircraft carried an unverified sensor, a maintenance record with a missing block of hours, and a trajectory through hazardous weather, the only responsible course was to keep it grounded. Connor ridiculed him before the other executives, branding him a former federal investigator haunted by past tragedies, a man who perceived catastrophe in every routine delay. Amelia, torn between her operations chief's confidence and her safety director's warning, proposed a compromise: let the aircraft depart, then reroute if conditions worsened. Mason refused. The atmosphere in the room shifted the instant he said no. This was no longer a technical disagreement among colleagues. It had become a direct clash between the chief executive's authority and the legal responsibility of the man whose signature authorized the flight. Amelia warned him that if he continued to block the departure, he would bear personal liability for every dollar lost to the delay. Mason replied without a trace of anger. Financial losses could always be quantified in currency, he told her. 180 lives could not. Word soon reached the conference room that passengers had already boarded and the flight crew awaited a final decision. Simultaneously, a major investor threatened to withdraw funding entirely if the flight experienced further delay. Connor quietly urged Amelia to demonstrate she was capable of running the company her father had built, framing the entire episode as a test of her leadership rather than a question of safety. Cornered from every angle, Amelia ordered the flight to proceed. Mason invoked his authority as director of flight safety to withhold the internal approval code the flight legally required. Without his signature in the system, the aircraft could not depart the gate. Connor suggested the airline simply accept whatever administrative penalty might follow and finalize the paperwork later. Amelia fixed her gaze on Mason, allowed a small, cold smile to cross her features, and uttered the words that would haunt her for the remainder of the year: launch it now. I'll cover the penalty. Mason explained, as calmly as he could, that this was not a matter of missing paperwork. If Amelia knowingly permitted an aircraft to operate while an unresolved safety warning remained on record, she could be violating federal regulations directly, and if anything went wrong in the air, she could face criminal liability, not merely a fine. Amelia interpreted the warning as a threat rather than a fact. She ordered security to confiscate his badge, announced his immediate termination, and placed Connor in temporary control of the safety department. Connor moved quickly, entering an override approval through his administrative access before anyone could intervene. The cabin door sealed. The tug began pushing the jet away from the gate. Mason did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to bypass security or plead with Amelia to reconsider. He simply retrieved his phone and dialed the emergency line for the Federal Aviation Oversight Agency, a number he still remembered from his investigative years. He confirmed his identity using an investigator credential that remained active in the agency's advisory system, even after his departure from government service. Then he outlined 3 concerns in plain, unhurried language. The maintenance record showed signs of tampering, a critical sensor had never completed verification, and airline leadership was knowingly dispatching the aircraft despite an active safety warning. Samuel Hayes on the other end asked for evidence. Mason forwarded copies of the data he had quietly saved before his system access was revoked, records he had learned never to leave unprotected. As Flight 217 approached the runway, the control tower received an urgent directive to hold the aircraft in position. The captain came over the intercom to inform the cabin that they did not yet have clearance to depart. Amelia, still convinced this was merely a brief interruption, turned to Connor for reassurance. Minutes later, a convoy of federal vehicles rolled into the operations area. Samuel Hayes stepped out, carrying an emergency inspection order for both the aircraft and the airline's operating records. Samuel informed the room that Flight 217 was grounded until an independent technical inspection could be completed. It was not only that single flight under scrutiny, the federal agency was suspending Madison Atlantic Airways self-certification privileges entirely, citing clear evidence of interference in the safety approval process. Amelia, furious, accused Mason of exploiting an old relationship with federal officials to exact revenge for his dismissal. Samuel flatly rejected the accusation. He explained that Mason's call had only triggered the review. The technical data transmitted by the aircraft's own systems was what gave the agency legal grounds to halt the flight. Inspectors moved toward the aircraft while ground staff calmly guided passengers back into the terminal. Connor attempted to slip out of the operations room to erase further records from the servers, but Grace Sullivan, the airline's chief counsel, noticed the unusual movement and immediately ordered technology staff to lock every administrative account in the building. Grace had spent much of the morning quietly reviewing access logs, cross-referencing them against the timestamps on the maintenance records Mason had already flagged. She had built her career on caution, reading every contract twice and trusting nothing that hadn't been verified in writing. That same caution allowed her to spot the small inconsistency that would later prove critical. She said nothing to Connor directly. Instead, she quietly instructed the technology team to preserve every version of every file before anyone could alter them again. Mason was invited back inside, though now only as a witness providing information, not as an employee of the airline. He did not walk past Amelia with any sense of triumph. Instead, his first request was that ground crews ensure every passenger received hotel accommodations, meals, and rebooked flights as quickly as possible. That single request unsettled Amelia more than anything he had said all day. She had assumed his only goal was to prove her wrong. Watching him now, she realized his attention had never once shifted away from the people who had been sitting on that aircraft. The initial inspection results confirmed the worst of Mason's suspicions. The recently installed pressure sensor had not only skipped verification, its serial number did not match anything on file. A technician named Jason Miller admitted, hands trembling, that Connor had personally instructed him to sign off on a procedure that had never actually been performed. Jason had complied out of fear of losing his job, but he had quietly retained a copy of the falsified work order, tucked away in case he ever needed proof of what had really happened. Amelia began to understand that Connor had been feeding her false information for longer than she wanted to admit. Samuel made it clear, however, that being deceived did not erase her responsibility. She had received a direct warning from Mason and chosen to ignore it anyway. Because Amelia held a commercial pilot's license and had used that authority to override an operations decision, the federal agency opened emergency proceedings to suspend it. Her own words in that conference room, once meant to sound commanding, now stood as evidence that the violation had been deliberate. The investigation soon widened to cover the airline's entire fleet. Mason worked alongside Grace and a team of federal inspectors, cross-referencing thousands of pages of maintenance history. What they found was a pattern stretching back nearly 2 years. Connor had been purchasing cut-rate components through a shell supplier he secretly owned a stake in, recording them as certified parts, splitting the profit difference with the supplier, pressuring technicians into signing falsified paperwork, and relying on an aggressive flight schedule to avoid the kind of deep inspection that might expose him. Investigators later learned that Connor had chosen his suppliers carefully, favoring companies just obscure enough to avoid attention during routine audits and structuring every transaction through layers of paperwork designed to appear ordinary to anyone not looking closely. He had cultivated relationships with a small circle of technicians over the years, some through genuine friendship and some through quiet financial favors, and he leaned on those relationships whenever a shortcut needed a signature. For a long time, the scheme worked precisely because nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Planes landed safely, schedules held. No one asked the kind of questions that might have unraveled it sooner. Flight 217 had been the most dangerous of all because the counterfeit pressure sensor could send false readings to the aircraft's cabin pressurization system. If the plane had reached cruising altitude with that sensor in place, the system might have responded far too slowly to a real pressure loss, and the storm along the route could have left the crew almost no time to identify the true cause before it was too late. Mason never claimed the aircraft was guaranteed to crash. What frightened him most about aviation safety, he told Grace one evening, was never a single catastrophic failure. It was the quiet combination of small failures stacking on top of each other, a false sensor reading, a falsified record, a dangerous storm, a rushed decision made under pressure. Any one of those alone might mean nothing. Together, they could mean everything. Amelia read through the full technical analysis and understood, perhaps for the first time, that Mason had not simply protected the airline's reputation. He had likely saved the lives of everyone who would have been on that aircraft. Connor tried one more time to shift blame back onto Amelia, presenting investigators with a stack of emails showing she had repeatedly pushed for shorter maintenance windows and stricter on-time performance. Amelia did not deny it. She admitted quietly and without excuse that she had built a culture where employees were afraid to raise concerns. She had not known about the counterfeit parts, but the atmosphere she created had made it far easier for Connor to hide them. Mason had every opportunity to destroy Amelia publicly in that moment. Instead, he offered only the facts without adding speculation and without softening her mistakes to protect her. When Grace asked why he didn't seem interested in getting revenge on the woman who had fired him, Mason answered simply that the purpose of a safety investigation was never to find someone to hate. It was to make sure the same failure never happened again. Amelia overheard that answer from just outside the doorway. For the first time since the crisis began, her shame had nothing to do with losing power. It came from realizing she had completely misjudged the one person in the building who had never once lied to her. Knowing his arrest was close, Connor made one final move. He took an old email of Mason's and altered it carefully, crafting a version that made it appear as though Mason had deliberately exaggerated the risks in order to seize control of the company for himself. The forged document leaked to the press within hours, and by the end of the day, Mason was being described across news segments as a bitter former investigator who had used the crisis to settle old scores. Several board members began calling for his removal from the investigation entirely. Meanwhile, Connor quietly prepared to leave the country on a private aircraft, departing from a small regional airport. Before he left, he attempted to wipe the servers containing evidence of his financial arrangements with the parts supplier. Grace noticed something wrong with the leaked email almost immediately. Its internal timestamp formatting did not match the airline's actual messaging system, though she didn't yet have proof strong enough to expose the forgery outright. Mason went through the data himself and found the flaw Connor had overlooked. The fabricated email referenced a component code that had not been added to the system until 6 months after the message was supposedly sent. Amelia faced a decision that would define her far more than anything that had happened before. If she stayed silent, she could let Mason absorb the blame and use the moment to convince the board to restore her full authority. If she told the truth, she would have to publicly admit that she had personally ordered a dangerous aircraft into the sky. At an emergency press conference, Amelia set aside the statement her communications team had prepared for her. She confirmed in her own words that Mason's warning had been correct from the beginning. She admitted that she had fired him and had personally attempted to bypass the safety process. She also stated clearly and without hesitation that the email being used against him showed every sign of being falsified. Her admission caused the company's stock to fall even further, but it also destroyed whatever plan Connor had left. Samuel used the financial records Grace had uncovered to secure an arrest order, and federal agents intercepted Connor at the regional airport before his aircraft ever left the ground. Inside his luggage, they found a hard drive containing payment records, a hidden account, and a list of every employee who had been pressured into signing falsified inspection documents. Connor was charged with fraud, falsifying safety records, obstructing a federal investigation, and endangering the operation of a commercial aircraft. Amelia's own reckoning, however, was far from finished. A hearing to determine the fate of her pilot's license and her role at the company was scheduled for the following morning. The hearing took place in a plain federal conference room with fluorescent lighting and rows of folding chairs, a space that felt almost too ordinary for a decision that would determine the future of an entire airline. It was attended by Amelia, Mason, Grace, Samuel, and several members of the airline's board, along with a handful of federal attorneys who spoke in the measured, unhurried tone of people who had done this many times before and understood exactly how much weight their words carried. A federal attorney played the recording captured inside the operations room that day, and the entire room heard Amelia's voice as clearly as if she were saying the words again for the first time, "Launch it now. I'll cover the penalty." Amelia did not deny it. She described the financial pressure she had been under, the manipulation she had suffered at Connor's hands, and the false data she had been given. But she never used any of it as an excuse. She acknowledged plainly that Mason had given her every reason she needed to delay that flight, and that she had chosen to ignore him anyway, out of fear of losing a contract and a need to prove her authority to the board. Federal representatives recommended a long suspension of her pilot's license, a permanent restriction from directly involving herself in operational safety decisions, placing Madison Atlantic Airways under special regulatory oversight, and requiring the entire leadership team to complete a comprehensive safety reform program. When Mason was called as a witness, many in the room expected him to ask for her license to be revoked permanently. Instead, he drew a careful distinction between two separate questions. He confirmed that Amelia's actions that day had been genuinely dangerous and deserved real consequences. But he also noted that she had not been part of the scheme involving the counterfeit parts, had admitted her mistakes publicly, and had provided evidence that helped bring Connor to justice. Mason recommended that Amelia be barred from the cockpit until she completed retraining, underwent an evaluation of her decision-making under pressure, and demonstrated in practice that she placed safety above profit. He was not asking for leniency. He was asking for a consequence that could actually change something rather than one that simply destroyed a person for the sake of destroying her. The board's final decision was severe but measured. Amelia's pilot's license would be suspended. The airline's self-certification privileges would remain revoked until further notice. Amelia herself would lose the authority to order a flight to depart or to intervene in any safety decision. Operations could not fully resume until the entire fleet passed inspection. And going forward, an independent director of safety would hold absolute veto power over any flight, a power no executive at the company could override again. With a single phone call and the right evidence behind it, Mason had ended the very privilege Amelia once treated as something she was simply entitled to. After the hearing, Amelia asked him quietly why he hadn't tried to destroy her when he clearly had the chance. Mason told her he had never made that call to punish anyone. He had made it because 180 people were sitting on an aircraft that was not safe to fly. The answer stayed with Amelia long after she left the building. The difference between them, she realized, had never truly been about power. It was that Mason never forgot that every number in a safety report represented a real person. 3 weeks later, the entire fleet underwent inspection. More than 10 components failed to meet certification standards and were replaced before they ever endangered another flight. Madison Atlantic Airways absorbed significant financial losses in the process, but it avoided a disaster that could have unfolded months or years down the road. The board asked Mason to return as director of flight safety, offering him a considerably higher salary. He agreed only after the contract guaranteed several conditions in writing. The safety department would operate independently of the finance division, no executive would ever again have the authority to override a technical hold, employees who reported safety concerns would receive full protection from retaliation, every warning would be logged in a system leadership could not access or alter, and executive bonuses would no longer be tied entirely to on-time performance. Amelia temporarily stepped down as chief executive and entered the safety reform program herself. She spent weeks working alongside ground crews, watching technicians examine every bolt, every wire, and every line of a maintenance log by hand. She learned the names of people she had only ever seen as line items in a budget report, men and women who had spent decades keeping aircraft safe without ever expecting recognition for it. One older mechanic, a woman named Carol, who had worked the hangar floor for over 20 years, told Amelia plainly that executives came and went every few years chasing quarterly numbers. But the people on the floor were the ones who had to live with whatever those executives decided. For the first time in her career, Amelia understood the real distance between a decision made behind glass walls and the consequences carried by the workers standing out on the runway. She began arriving before sunrise, not because anyone required it of her, but because she wanted to see the airline the way Mason had always seen it, one inspection at a time, one honest report at a time. 6 months later, the federal agency scheduled a test flight for the very aircraft once assigned to Flight 217. No passengers were on board, only a test crew, inspectors, and a technical team monitoring every system. Amelia was not permitted to sit in the cockpit. She observed from the rear cabin as a trainee in the safety reform program, nothing more. Partway through the test, a warning system registered a small fluctuation. The pilot suggested continuing since the readings still fell within acceptable limits. Amelia looked over the data and requested that the aircraft return to the airport for inspection instead. The decision cost the airline tens of thousands of dollars in additional testing. After landing, the technical team discovered a loose electrical connection, not dangerous during a short test flight, but the kind of flaw that could grow into a real hazard after repeated cycles of use. Mason realized, watching from the operations center, that Amelia had genuinely changed. She had not made that call to impress him. She had made it because she finally understood the principle he had spent his entire career defending. Samuel agreed to consider restoring part of Amelia's pilot's license once she completed every remaining requirement, though her authority to influence the airline's safety decisions would remain limited for the foreseeable future. Amelia accepted the terms without argument. A year later, Madison Atlantic Airways resumed full operations under an entirely new structure. The airline no longer led the industry in on-time performance, but it became known as one of the most transparent carriers when it came to reporting safety concerns. Mason built a new program he called One Voice Can Ground a Flight, giving any technician, flight attendant, or pilot the authority to stop a flight the moment they identified a real risk without fear of retaliation from anyone above them. Jason Miller, the technician Connor had once pressured into signing falsified paperwork, was reinstated and became the airline's lead trainer in maintenance ethics for new employees. Grace was appointed to the airline's newly formed independent oversight board. Amelia returned to the company, though not with the unchecked authority she once held. She agreed that the safety board would carry veto power over every decision she made going forward. During a company-wide meeting, Amelia stood in front of the entire staff and offered Mason a public apology. She admitted she had mistaken his silence for weakness, his caution for fear, and power itself for genuine leadership. Mason had never asked her to apologize in front of anyone. Still, he accepted it because it sent a message every employee in that room needed to hear. No one at the company stood above the safety process, not even the woman whose name was on the building. Over time, the relationship between Mason and Amelia shifted from confrontation towards something closer to mutual respect. Any hint of deeper feelings stayed subtle, carried only in quiet conversations after long shifts, shared cups of coffee in the operations center, and the way Amelia slowly began asking him about the parts of his life that had nothing to do with the airline. Mason kept a careful professional distance. He had no interest in a relationship built on gratitude or guilt. Amelia understood that and never pushed. She told him only that whenever he felt she had truly become a different person, she would like to invite him to a dinner that had nothing to do with airplanes, shareholders, or federal investigations. Mason didn't agree right away, but for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he smiled at her. The story closes on the morning Madison Atlantic Airways officially relaunched its Denver to London route. The fully inspected aircraft sat waiting under the early sunlight, and the flight crew moved through every checklist without being rushed by a clock or pressured by cameras. Mason stood in the operations center, reviewing the weather data and technical records one final time. Amelia walked over and set the last approval form in front of him. Instead of signing it herself or issuing an order, she simply asked him a question: "Do you think it's ready?" Mason checked the numbers one more time and confirmed that every condition had been met. The aircraft took off without incident, its engines rising into a clear morning sky with none of the frantic energy that had surrounded Flight 217 a year earlier. There were no investors watching from a private lounge, no journalists counting down the minutes until departure, only a quiet runway and a crew that had been given all the time they needed. From the observation deck, Amelia watched it climb into the sky and admitted that she used to believe money could fix any consequence, no matter how serious. Mason answered quietly that money could cover a fine. It could never bring an aircraft back once it was already too late. That evening, Mason went home to a brief, quiet scene with Luke. The boy asked if his father had saved anyone that day. Mason told him he had simply done his job the way he always tried to. His phone buzzed with a message from Amelia inviting both father and son to the company's family day that weekend. Mason looked at Luke, who was already smiling at the idea, and agreed. The story ends with a simple truth carried through every scene that came before it. Real power was never the ability to force other people to follow an order. Real power was the courage to stop everything when everyone else was pushing forward. Amelia had once believed she could pay her way out of any mistake. Mason showed her that in aviation, there were some prices no one, no matter how wealthy, could ever afford to pay.